The rain hadn't stopped for 3 days. Lena Moore pulled her coat tighter as she stepped into the attic of her grandmother's farmhouse, the wooden stairs groaning under her weight. The air smelled of damp wood and forgotten things. Boxes of old Christmas decorations, yellowed newspapers, and a broken rocking chair crowded the space. She'd spent every summer here as a child, but now, with Grandma gone, the house felt like a stranger. Her flashlight flickered as she scanned the room. The realtor had been clear. Clean it out, sell it fast. No one wanted a crumbling house in the middle of nowhere. But as Lena reached for a box, a cold draft brushed her neck. She turned, frowning. The attic window was sealed shut. Then she heard it. A faint tap, 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 like fingers drumming on wood. Following the sound, she knelt near the far wall. The paneling was warped, the nails rusted. She pressed her palm against it. Hollow. Her pulse quickened. Grabbing a crowbar from the toolbox, she wedged it into the gap and pulled. With a splintering crack, the wood gave way. Dust swirled in the beam of her flashlight. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small leather-bound journal, its cover cracked with age. Lena's breath caught as she lifted it. The first page was brittle. The ink faded but legible. March 3rd, 1942. If anyone finds this... I'm already gone. Name beneath it sent a chill down her spine. Evelyn Granger. Lena had never heard that name before. But as she turned the next page, one thing became clear. Evelyn hadn't just written a diary. She'd left a warning. The journal's pages crackled under Lena's trembling fingers as she turned them, each entry pulling her deeper into Evelyn's world. The ink was faded in places, but the words were sharp, desperate. Evelyn had been young, only 24, living in this very house during the war. At first, her entries were ordinary. Chores, the loneliness of her family leaving to help the war effort, the way the wind whistled through the old oak outside her window. But then, the tone shifted. Something was wrong with the house. She wrote about footsteps in empty hallways, whispers that curled around her like smoke when she tried to sleep. One night, she woke to the sound of scratching inside the walls, as if something were crawling between them, searching for a way out, or a way in. Lena's skin prickled as she read Evelyn's frantic scribbles. It's not rats. It's too deliberate, too knowing. By mid-1942, Evelyn's entries grew darker. She wrote of a presence, a man she never saw but felt, his breath on the back of her neck when she stood too still, his shadow stretching further than it should in the lamplight. The townspeople dismissed her, called her hysterical. Even her own family refused to believe her. Then came the worst entry of all. Dated, just a week before the journal abruptly ended. Thomas came last night. He promised to take me away, but when he stepped into the house, the air turned thick, like the walls were breathing. I heard him scream. Then, silence. This morning, they told me he left for the front. But I know. The house took him. Lena's throat tightened. She flipped to the last page. The final entry was a single sentence, the ink smeared as if Evelyn had been crying, or fighting. If anyone finds this, bury me properly. He still has me. The journal slipped from Lena's hands. Outside, the storm howled, rattling the attic window like it wanted in. Lena couldn't sleep that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Evelyn's desperate handwriting, the way the ink had bled into the paper like a wound. By dawn, she was already dressed, the journal tucked into her bag as she drove into the nearest town, her tires kicking up gravel on the empty back roads. The local library was a squat brick building with a flickering neon sign that read, History and Genealogy. Inside, the air smelled of old paper and dust, and the librarian, a thin woman with wire-rimmed glasses, barely looked up as Lena approached the counter. I'm looking for records on someone, Lena said, her voice steadier than she felt. Evelyn Granger, She lived here in the 1940s. The librarian's fingers paused over her keyboard. For a moment, Lena thought she saw something flicker in the woman's eyes. Recognition. Fear. But then it was gone. Granger. The woman repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of the name. That's an old family around here. Not many left. She led Lena to a row of microfiche machines and pulled a dusty reel from a drawer labeled 1940-1952. "Start here," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "But some things are better left buried." Lena ignored the warning. For hours, she scrolled through grainy newspaper scans, her eyes straining in the dim light. Birth announcements, wedding notices, obituaries, nothing about Evelyn. Then, just as she was about to give up, she found it. A tiny article buried in the back of the Ash Grove Gazette, dated October 12, 1942. The headline made her stomach drop. "Local woman committed to asylum after bizarre delusions." The He article was brief, clinical, but the photo beneath it was unmistakable. Evelyn, her face gaunt, her eyes wide with terror, being led away in a straitjacket. The caption read, "Evelyn Granger, 24, was remanded to Ash Grove State Hospital after claiming her family home was haunted by a malevolent presence. Doctors diagnosed her with hysterical neurosis." Lena's hands shook as she read the final line. Miss Granger's family declined to comment, citing shame and the need to protect their reputation. She barely remembered leaving the library. The sun was setting by the time she reached the outskirts of town, where the old asylum loomed behind a rusted iron fence. Ash Grove had been abandoned for decades, its windows boarded, its walls choked with ivy. Lena parked her car on the overgrown driveway, her heart pounding. She shouldn't be here, but Evelyn's voice echoed in her mind. "Bury me properly." The front doors were chained shut, but a side entrance hung ajar. The wood splintered as if something had forced its way out, or in. The air inside was thick with mildew and something else, something metallic. Old blood? Lena's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and a hallway lined with doors, each marked with a number. Patient rooms. At the end of the hall, a staircase descended into pitch blackness. The records room had to be down there. Her footsteps echoed as she crept downstairs, the temperature dropping with every step. The basement was a maze of filing cabinets, their drawers rusted shut. She pried one open, her fingers brushing against brittle paper. Patient 4472. Evelyn Granger. The file was thin, just a few pages. Admission notes. A doctor's scrawl. Patient insists the man in the walls is real. Claims he took her lover. No improvement with treatment. And then, at the very bottom, a single line that made Lena's blood run cold. Deceased, November 3, 1943. Cause of death, cardiac arrest. No next of kin notified. Lena sank to her knees. Evelyn had died here, alone, erased by her own family, and no one had ever come for her. The farmhouse seemed darker when Lena returned, as if the walls had absorbed the weight of what she discovered at the asylum. She clutched Evelyn's journal in one hand and a rusted shovel in the other, her resolve hardening with each step. She took toward the overgrown garden at the back of the property. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long skeletal shadows from the gnarled oak tree that had stood sentinel over the house for centuries. The same tree Evelyn had written about, its branches scraping against her window like bony fingers. Lena had chosen a spot near its roots, where the earth was soft and the wildflowers grew thickest. If Evelyn had loved this place once, before the darkness took hold, then she deserved to be remembered here, where the sun could still reach her. The first thrust of the shovel into the soil felt like breaking a seal, as if the ground itself had been waiting for this moment. The deeper Lena dug, the colder the air became, until her breath fogged in front of her, though the night was warm. She worked in silence, her muscles burning, until the hole was deep enough to hold more than just a journal. From her bag, she pulled a small wooden box she'd bought at the antique store in town, its surface carved with forget-me-nots. The same flowers Evelyn had pressed between the pages of her diary. Inside, she placed the journal, along with a photograph she'd salvaged from the asylum records, the only image left of Evelyn's face. She'd wrapped the box in a scrap of lace from the attic, something delicate and forgotten, like Evelyn herself. As she lowered it into the earth, the wind picked up, whispering through the leaves in a language just beyond understanding. Lena pressed her palms into the dirt, her voice barely above a whisper as she recited the words she'd practiced in the car. Evelyn Granger, you were real. You were loved. You are free now. She didn't know if rituals mattered, if ghosts could hear the living, but the moment the last handful of soil covered the box, the air shifted. The oppressive weight that had clung to the house since she'd arrived lifted, as if something had been holding its breath for 80 years, and finally let go. Exhausted, Lena stumbled back inside, her clothes streaked with dirt, her hands raw. She lit every candle she could find, as if the light could keep the shadows at bay, and collapsed into the armchair by the fireplace. The mirror above the mantel, an antique with a tarnished silver frame, reflected the flickering flames, and, for a heartbeat, something else. A flicker of movement, a face that wasn't hers. Lena froze. The reflection in the mirror wasn't moving with her. It was smiling. A young woman with hollow cheeks and sad, knowing eyes. Evelyn. The candlelight seemed to bend around her, as if she were both there and not there, a memory made flesh. Then, as quickly as she'd appeared, she faded, her image dissolving like smoke. But the glass didn't empty. Words appeared, etched in the condensation of Lena's own breath, as if an invisible finger had traced them. Thank you. Lena's tears came then, hot and uncontrollable. She hadn't realized how badly she'd needed proof, not just of Evelyn's existence, but of her own belief. The house creaked around her, not with menace but with something like relief. That night, for the first time since she'd arrived, Lena slept without dreaming. The morning sun spilled through the farmhouse's dusty windows, painting the floorboards in streaks of gold, but Lena barely noticed the warmth as she sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tracing the edges of the old property deeds she'd found tucked behind a loose floorboard in the attic. The brittle parchment crackled under her touch. The ink faded to a ghostly brown, but the words were still legible. Granger, Family Estate, 1898, followed by a list of names that made her blood run cold. The house hadn't always belonged to Evelyn's family. Before them, it had been owned by a man named Silas Voss, a reclusive doctor who'd been accused of unnatural experiments before vanishing without a trace in 1903. The townsfolk had whispered about disappearances. Young women, mostly, servants and seamstresses who'd worked at the house and then vanished, their bodies never found. The deeds included a crude sketch of the property, and there, in the corner of the page, was a notation that sent a shiver down Lena's spine. Subterranean Chamber, N.W. Corner of Cellar, sealed 1903 per sheriff's order. Lena's hands trembled as she set the parchment down. The cellar. She'd avoided it since arriving, repelled by the damp, greasy air that seeped through its door, the way the hinges screamed like a living thing when she'd tried to open it days ago. But now, with Evelyn's journal buried and the words, "He still has me," echoing in her mind, she knew she couldn't leave without seeing what Silas had left behind. The cellar door resisted at first, the wood swollen with decades of moisture, but with a final, splintering yank, it gave way. The stench that rolled out was thick, wet earth, rust, and something sweetly rotten, like meat left too long in the sun. Her flashlight beam cut through the blackness, revealing stone walls slick with moss, shelves of long-shattered preserves, and, in the far corner, a patch of newer brickwork, the mortar uneven, as if someone had sealed it in a hurry. The pickaxe, she'd brought from the shed felt heavy in her hands. The first strike sent a spiderweb of cracks through the bricks. The second punched a hole into darkness. A gust of air sighed out, colder than the cellar, smelling of old bone and dried herbs. Lena's breath fogged as she widened the gap, her pulse a frantic drum in her throat. The chamber beyond was small, no larger than a closet, its walls lined, with strange symbols carved into the stone, protection sigils or something worse. But it was the center of the room that made her gag. A rusted iron chair, its arms fitted with leather restraints, sat atop a stained wooden grate. Beneath it, barely visible in the flickering light, was a pile of yellowed bones. Not animal, human. Femurs, ribs, a skull with a single jagged crack running through its temple, and, tangled among them, a tarnished locket, its hinge broken. Lena didn't need to open it to know whose face she'd find inside. She stumbled back, her stomach heaving. Silas hadn't just experimented on women. He'd kept them. And the house, the God-forsaken, hungry house, had remembered. It had learned. From him. That's why it took Thomas. That's why it never let Evelyn go. It had a taste for the lost. Above her, the floorboards groaned. Not the usual settling of an old house. This was deliberate. Footsteps. Heavy, slow, moving from the attic. Toward the stairs. Toward her. The footsteps stopped at the top of the cellar stairs, and in that terrible silence Lena realized she had made a fatal mistake. She had buried Evelyn's journal, yes, but she had also disturbed something far older, far hungrier, something that had been waiting behind those bricks for over a century, biding its time in the dark. The air grew thick, pressing against her skin like invisible hands, and the temperature plummeted so suddenly her teeth chattered. From the hole in the wall, a sound emerged, not a groan or a whisper, but a wet, clicking noise, like bones snapping back into place after decades of disuse. The pile of remains shifted, the skull rolling toward her with a hollow scrape, its empty sockets seeming to fix on her face. Lena's legs refused to move. Terror had rooted her to the spot. Above, the footsteps descended, each creak of the stairs louder than the last, until the cellar door swung open with a crash, revealing not a person, but a shadow. A man-shaped void that swallowed the light around it, its edges fraying like smoke. It had no face, but she felt its gaze like a physical weight, a predatory interest that made her stomach twist. Silas. Not a ghost, not a memory, but something worse, a remnant, a stain left on the house by his atrocities, fed by every death it had caused since. The shadow stepped forward and the walls around it breathed, the stones bulging inward as if something were pressing against them from the other side. Lena's flashlight flickered, then died, plunging her into near darkness. Only the dim glow from the hole in the wall remained, casting a sickly light on the iron chair, the restraints now twitching as if gripped by invisible hands. A voice slithered into her mind, not through her ears but directly into her thoughts, oily and insistent. "You look like her. The last one. The one who got away." Her grandmother. The realization hit her like a punch. Grandma had known. She'd known what the house was, why it demanded silence, why she'd boarded up the attic and never spoke of her childhood. She'd escaped, but she'd left Evelyn behind. The shadow surged toward her, and Lena finally found her voice. Not a scream, but a name. "Evelyn!" The second the word left her lips, the cellar door slammed shut. The shadow recoiled, its form rippling like disturbed water. From the hole in the wall, a hand shot out, skeletal, yes, but wreathed in a pale, shimmering light. It grasped the shadow's ankle, and Silas's remnant howled, a sound that shook dust from the ceiling. The other bones rattled, rising into the air, assembling themselves into a skeletal figure that lunged at the shadow with unnatural speed. Lena didn't wait to see more. She scrambled up the stairs, her palms scraping against splintered wood, and threw herself against the door. It didn't budge. Behind her, the sounds of struggle grew louder. Snarls, the crack of bone, a high, keening wail. Then, silence. The door swung open on its own. The cellar was empty. No shadow, no bones. Only the hole in the wall, now dark and still. But on the bottom step, gleaming in the thin moonlight, lay the locket. Lena picked it up with shaking fingers. Inside was a tiny photograph of Evelyn, her smile soft, her eyes alive. The clasp was warm to the touch, as if held by a living hand seconds before. The farmhouse stood silent under the pale morning light, its weathered boards and sagging porch looking almost innocent now, as if the horrors of the night before had been nothing but a fever dream. Lena sat on the back steps, Evelyn's locket clutched tight in her palm, the metal still strangely warm against her skin. She'd spent the remaining hours until dawn packing her car with anything worth saving: her grandmother's quilts, a few yellowed photographs, the deed to the property that now bore the weight of so much blood and silence. The rest could burn. The gas canisters from the shed sat lined up by the front door, their contents sloshing ominously as she carried them from room to room, dousing the floors, the walls, the attic where it had all begun. She saved the cellar for last. Standing in that dank, reeking space, staring at the hole where Silas's victims had been hidden for over a century, she struck a match. The flame trembled in her fingers, casting dancing shadows that looked for one heart-stopping moment, like skeletal hands reaching back for her. Then she let it drop. Fire raced across the gasoline-soaked floorboards, hungry and bright, its heat pressing against her face like a living thing as she stumbled back up the stairs. By the time she reached the driveway, the first tendrils of smoke were curling from the windows, black and thick as oil. The old oak tree shuddered in the rising wind, its branches clawing at the sky as if trying to escape what was coming. Lena didn't look away as the flames burst through the roof, as the porch collapsed in a shower of sparks, as the house groaned like a dying beast. She owed it to Evelyn to watch, to bear witness. In the ashes, days later, the fire marshal would find no trace of bones, no hidden chamber, just charred timber and the ghost of a story no one would believe. But Lena knew the truth. She felt it in the weight of the locket around her neck, in the way the wind sometimes carried a whisper that sounded like her name, spoken in a voice that was almost familiar. She'd kept one thing from the house, after all. Not an object, but a promise. On the drive back to the city, she stopped at a quiet cemetery outside Ashgrove, where the unnamed dead of the asylum were buried in unmarked graves. The headstone she placed was small, just a slab of granite with 2 words carved deep. Evelyn Granger. No dates, no epitaph. Just a name returned to the world after 80 years of silence. That night, in her apartment hundreds of miles away, Lena dreamed of a sunlit field and a young woman in a faded dress, her face turned toward the sky. She was smiling. And when Lena woke, the locket was warm against her skin, the clasp undone, the photograph inside gone.
Subscribe and press the bell icon so that you never miss the amazing video.